Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How we doing? Spectre here with another edition of Midnight Rider. We'll call this the midday edition, but it's been a bit of a rainy day here, so figured what the heck, as things clear out, start drying up here, wait for the grass to dry out, maybe get a little yard work done. I figured we'd squeeze in an episode here and see if we can knock out another session of the virtue of selfishness. So that's what we're going to do here this afternoon. Stick around. We'll see you back on the other side. As the saying goes, get woke, go broke. We, the people, recently learned that two corporations, part of the Civic Alliance, and 90 CEOs in a Zoom call, went to oppose election integrity laws in Georgia. These corporations, they know what's best for we, the people. These corporations think they wield we flaunt and thwart the will of we, the people. These corporations hide behind legal terms like personhood, thereby giving said corporations dead entities like we, the people. These corporations virtue signal at every opportunity what we, the people, should embody. We, the people, have forgotten how to play the game. And it's time we, the people, step into the light. We, the people, have more power than they know. We, the people, have the ability to vote with our dollars. We, the people, have had enough of the fraud and are collectively throwing up the window and yelling, "We're mad as hell, and we're not going to take it anymore." We, the people, keep our tongues from evil and our lips. These corporations have given our mouths to evil and our tongues frame deceit. We, the people, fellowship and corporate. We, the people, admonish them. We, the people, having souls, know our rights are inherent and come by the hand of God, whereas these corporations are soulless and for their privileges masquerading as rights. We, the people, will continue to witness the destruction of the old guard, and we, the people, will build around, through, and without these corporations. So help us God. This has been a PSA by Brad. Alright, welcome back everybody. Thank you for joining here today. If you're joining on YouTube, appreciate you being here. Over on Twitch, we are over on DLive, and of course our friends over on the Tiger Network, thanks for joining. And don't forget, if things go sideways, you can always check me out over on Trovo Live, as well as Vaughn Live. We are established over there as well. So, that being said, let's jump into it here today and pick up where we left off last with the old Ayn Rand here. And so today, like I said, the Virtue of Selfishness 50th Anniversary Edition is what I'll be reading from November 1st, 1964. Obviously, you can pick that up over at your bookstore of choice. I'm not by any way, shape, or form referencing that one should go pick this up at Bezos's establishment here. But nonetheless, that's what we're reading from here. That being said, we're going to pick it up right where we left off on Chapter 14, and we'll see how far we get here today. I haven't decided if I want to try and power through this sucker and get all the way to the end here, or if I'm just going to break it into two here and just do the 14, 15, 16 chapters here. So we'll see how things go here. Alright, so Chapter 14 is where we're going to pick up the nature of government. Let's jump over there. Alright, so Ayn Rand pens this. The nature of government. A government is an institution that holds the exclusive power to enforce certain rules of social conduct in a given geographical area. Do men need such an institution, and why? Since man's mind is his basic tool of survival, his means of gaining knowledge to guide his actions, the basic condition he requires is the freedom to think and to act according to his rational judgment. The key word being rational, I suppose. This does not mean that a man must live alone and that a desert island is the environment best suited to his needs. Men can derive enormous benefits from dealing with one another. A social environment is most conducive to their successful survival, but only on certain conditions. The two great values to be gained from social existence are knowledge and trade. Man is the only species that can transmit and expand his store of knowledge from generation to generation. The knowledge potentially available to man is greater than any one man could begin to acquire in his own lifespan. Every man gains an incalculable benefit from the knowledge discovered by others. The second great benefit is the division of labor. It enables a man to devote his effort to a particular field of work and to trade with others who specialize in other fields. This form of cooperation allows all men who take part in it to achieve a greater knowledge, skill, and productive return on their effort than they could achieve if each had to produce everything he needs on a desert island or on a self-sustaining farm. But these very benefits indicate, delimit, and define what kind of men can be of value to one another, and in what kind of society. Only rational, productive, independent men in a rational, productive, free society. And that's out of the objectivist ethics. A society that robs an individual of the product of his effort, or enslaves him, or attempts to limit the freedom of his mind, or compels him to act against his own rational judgment. A society that sets up a conflict between its edicts and the requirements of man's nature is not, strictly speaking, a society, but a mob held together by institutionalized gang rule. Such a society destroys all the values of a human coexistence, has no possible justification, and represents not a source of benefits, but the deadliest threat to man's survival. Life on a desert island is safer than, and incomparably preferable to, existence in Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany. And maybe even one might surmise even here in these United States as of late, depending on your location and where you live. If men are to live together in a peaceful, productive, rational society and deal with one another to mutual benefit, they must accept the basic social principle, without which no moral or civilized society is possible. The principle of individual rights. And of course, we covered those in chapters past here. You can go back on the channel and in the archives to pick those up on session 4 of the series here. To recognize individual rights means to recognize and accept the conditions required by man's nature for his proper survival. Man's rights can be violated only by the use of physical force. It is only by means of physical force that one man can deprive another of his life, or enslave him, or rob him, or prevent him from pursuing his own goals, or compel him to act against his own rational judgment. The precondition of a civilized society is the barring of physical force from social relationships, thus establishing the principle that if men wish to deal with one another, they must do so only by means of reason. by discussion, persuasion, and voluntary, uncoerced agreement. How much of that are we seeing play out in society today? Discussion? Nope. Persuasion? Nope. Voluntary? No. Uncoerced? I think not. The necessary consequence of man's right to life is his right to self-defense. In a civilized society, force may be used only in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use. All the reasons which make the initiation of physical force an evil make the retaliatory use of physical force a moral imperative. And I guess I'll pause yet again and say, that's an inalienable right, right? And who is trying to take that away? Our right to self-defense. If some pacifist society renounced the retaliatory use of force, it would be left helplessly at the mercy of the first thug who decided to be immoral. Such a society would achieve the opposite of its intention. Instead of abolishing evil, it would encourage and reward it. If a society provided no organized protection against force, it would compel every citizen to go about armed, to turn his home into a fortress, to shoot any strangers approaching his door, or to join a protective gang of citizens who would fight other gangs formed for the same purpose, and thus bring about the degeneration of that society into the chaos of gang rule, in effect, rule by brute force, and the perpetual tribal warfare of prehistoric savages. The use of physical force, even its retaliatory use, cannot be left at the discretion of individual citizens. Peaceful coexistence is impossible if a man has to live under the constant threat of force to be unleashed against him by any of his neighbors at any moment. Whether his neighbors' intentions are good or bad, whether their judgment is rational or irrational, whether they are motivated by a sense of justice or by ignorance, or by prejudice or by malice, the use of force against one man cannot be left to the arbitrary decision of another. Visualize, for example, what would happen if a man missed his wallet, concluded that he had been robbed, broke into every house in the neighborhood to search for it, and shot the first man who gave him a dirty look, taking the look to be proof of guilt. The retaliatory use of force requires objective rules of evidence to establish that a crime has been committed and to prove who committed it, as well as objective rules to define punishments and enforcement procedures. Men who attempt to prosecute crimes without such rules are a lynch mob. If a society left the retaliatory use of force in the hands of individual citizens, it would degenerate into mob rule, lynch law, and an endless series of bloody private feuds or vendettas. If physical force is to be barred from social relationships, men need an institution charged with the task of protecting their rights under an objective code of rules. This is the task of a government, of a proper government. Its basic task is only moral justification and the reason why men do not need a government. Why men do need a government, rather. A government is the means of placing the retaliatory use of physical force under objective control, in effect under objectively defined laws. The fundamental difference between private action and governmental action, a difference thoroughly ignored and evaded today, lies in the fact that a government holds a monopoly on the legal use of physical force. It has to hold such a monopoly since it is the agent of restraining and combating the use of force. And for that very same reason, its actions have to be rigidly defined, delimited, and circumscribed. No touch of whim or caprice should be permitted in its performance. It should be an impersonal robot, with the laws as its only motive power. If a society is to be free, its government has to be controlled. Under a proper social system, a private individual is legally free to take any action he pleases, so long as he does not violate the rights of others, while a government official is bound by law in his every official act. A private individual may do anything except that which is legally forbidden. A government officially may do nothing except that which is legally permitted. See the difference there? This is the means of subordinating might to right. This is the American concept of a government of laws and not of men. The nature of the laws proper to a free society and the source of its government's authority are both to be derived from the nature and purpose of a proper government. The basic principle of both is indicated in the Declaration of Independence. To secure these individual rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Since the protection of individual rights is the only proper purpose of a government, it is the only proper subject of legislation. All laws must be based on individual rights and aimed at their protection. All laws must be objective and objectively justifiable. Men must know clearly and in advance of taking an action what the law forbids them to do and why, what constitutes a crime, and what penalty they will incur if they commit it. The source of the government's authority is the consent of the governed. This means that the government is not the ruler, but the servant or agent of the citizens. It means that the government as such has no rights except the rights delegated to it by the citizens for a specific purpose. There is only one basic principle to which an individual must consent if he wishes to live in a free, civilized society: the principle of renouncing the use of physical force and delegating to the government his right of physical self-defense for the purpose of an orderly, objective, legally defined enforcement. Or, to put it another way, he must accept the separation of force and whim, any whim including his own. Now, what happens in case of a disagreement between two men about an undertaking in which both are involved? In a free society, men are not forced to deal with one another. They do so only by voluntary agreement and, when a time element is involved, by contract. If a contract is broken by the arbitrary decision of one man, it may cause a disastrous financial injury to the other, and the victim would have no recourse except to seize the offender's property as compensation. But here again, the use of force cannot be left to the decision of private individuals, and this leads to one of the most important and most complex functions of the government, to the function of an arbiter, who settles disputes among men according to objective laws. And I guess I'll pause right quick there and say that did you know that arbitration, let's say, has been around far longer than our court system has? It actually dates back to biblical times. So, when we see injustices playing out in courtrooms all across America, or just our system of just us, do you think we still have ways to settle disputes? Certainly. Arbitration. Keep that in mind. That being said, criminals are a small minority in any semi-civilized society, but the protection and enforcement of contracts through courts of civil law is the most crucial need of a peaceful society. Without such protection, no civilization could be developed or maintained. Man cannot survive, as animals do, by acting on the range of the immediate moment. Man has to project his goals and achieve them across a span of time. He has to calculate his actions and plan his life long range. The better a man's mind and the greater his knowledge, the longer the range of his planning. The higher or more complex a civilization, the longer the range of activity it requires, and, therefore, the longer the range of contractual agreements among men, and the more urgent their need of protection for the security of such agreements. Even a primitive barter society could not function if a man agreed to trade a bushel of potatoes for a basket of eggs, and, having received the eggs, refused to deliver the potatoes. Visualize what this sort of whim-directed action would mean in an industrialized society, where men deliver $1 billion worth of goods on credit, or contract to build multi-million-dollar structures, or sign 99-year leases. A unilateral breach of contract involves an indirect use of physical force. It consists, in essence, of one man receiving the material values, goods, or services of another, then refusing to pay for them, and thus keeping them by force, by mere physical possession, not by right, in effect keeping them without the consent of their owner. Fraud involves a similar indirect use of force. It consists of obtaining material values without their owner's consent, under false pretenses or false promises. Extortion is another variant of an indirect use of force. It consists of obtaining material values not in exchange for values, but by the threat of force, violence, or injury. Some of these actions are obviously criminal. Others, such as unilateral breach of contract, may not be criminally motivated, but may be caused by irresponsibility and irrationality. Still, others may be complex issues with some claim to justice on both sides. But whatever the case may be, all such issues have to be made subject to objectively defined laws, and have to be resolved by an impartial arbiter, administering the laws, in effect by a judge and a jury when appropriate. Observe the basic principle governing justice in all these cases. It is the principle that no man may obtain any values from others without the owner's consent, and, as a corollary, that a man's rights may not be left at the mercy of the unilateral decision, the arbitrary choice, the irrationality, the whim of another man. Such, in essence, is the proper purpose of a government, to make social existence possible to men, by protecting the benefits and combating the evils which men can cause to one another. The proper functions of a government fall into three broad categories, all of them involving the issues of physical force and the protection of men's rights. The police, to protect men from criminals, the armed services, to protect men from foreign invaders, and the law courts, to settle disputes among men according to objective laws. These three categories involve many corollary and derivative issues, and their implementation and practice in the form of specific legislation is enormously complex. It belongs to the field of a special science, the philosophy of law. Many errors and many disagreements are possible in the field of implementation, but what is essential here is a principle to be implemented, the principle that the purpose of law and of government is the protection of individual rights. Today, the principle is forgotten, ignored, and evaded. The result is the present state of the world, with mankind's retrogression to the lawlessness of absolutist tyranny, to the primitive savagery of rule by brute force. In unthinking protest against this trend, some people are raising the question of whether government as such is evil by nature, and whether anarchy is the ideal social system. Anarchy as a political concept is a naive floating abstraction. For all the reasons discussed above, a society without an organized government would be at the mercy of the first criminal who came along and who would precipitate it into the chaos of gang warfare. But the possibility of human immorality is not the only objection to anarchy. Even a society whose every member were fully rational and faultlessly moral could not function in a state of anarchy. It is the need of objective laws and of an arbiter for honest disagreements among men that necessitates the establishment of a government. A recent variant of anarchist theory, which is befuddling some of the younger advocates of freedom, is a weird absurdity called competing governments, accepting the basic premise of the modern statists who see no difference between the functions of government and the functions of industry, between force and production, and who advocate government ownership of business. The proponents of competing governments take the other side of the same coin and declare that since competition is so beneficial to business, it should also be applied to government. Instead of a single monopolistic government, they declare, there should be a number of different governments in the same geographical area, competing for the allegiance of individual citizens, with every citizen free to shop and to patronize whatever government he chooses. Remember that forcible restraint of men is the only service a government has to offer. Ask yourself what a competition enforceable restraint would have to mean. One cannot call this theory a contradiction in terms, since it is obviously devoid of any understanding of the terms competition and government, nor can one call it a floating abstraction, since it is devoid of any contact with or reference to reality and cannot be concretized at all, not even roughly or approximately. One illustration will be sufficient. Suppose Mr. Smith, a customer of Government A, suspects that his next-door neighbor, Mr. Jones, a customer of Government B, has robbed him. A squad of police A proceeds to Mr. Jones' house and is met at the door by a squad of police B, who declare that they do not accept the validity of Mr. Smith's complaint and do not recognize the authority of Government A. What happens then? You take it from there. The evolution of the concept of government has had a long, tortuous history. Some glimmer of the government's proper function seems to have existed in every organized society, manifesting itself in such phenomena as the recognition of some implicit, if often non-existent, difference between a government and a robber gang, the aura of respect and of moral authority granted to the government as the guardian of law and order, the fact that even the most evil types of government found it necessary to maintain some semblance of order and some pretense at justice, if only by routine and tradition, and to claim some sort of moral justification for their power, of a mystical or social nature. Just as the absolute monarchs of France had to invoke the divine right of kings, so the modern dictators of Soviet Russia have to spend fortunes on propaganda to justify their rule in the eyes of their enslaved subjects. In mankind's history, the understanding of the government's proper function is a very recent achievement. It is only 200 years old, and it dates from the founding fathers of the American Revolution. Not only did they identify the nature and the needs of a free society, but they devised the means to translate it into practice. A free society, like any other human product, cannot be achieved by random means, by mere wishing or by the leader's good intentions. A complex legal system based on objectively valid principles is required to make a society free and to keep it free. A system that does not depend on the motives, the moral character, or the intentions of any given official. A system that leaves no opportunity, no legal loophole for the development of tyranny. The American system of checks and balances was just such an achievement, and although certain contradictions in the Constitution did leave a loophole for the growth of statism, the incomparable achievement was the concept of a constitution as a means of limiting and restricting the power of the government. Today, when a concerted effort is made to obliterate this point, it cannot be repeated too often that the Constitution is a limitation on the government, not on private individuals, that it does not prescribe the conduct of private individuals, only the conduct of the government, that it is not a charter for government power, but a charter of the citizens' protection against the government. Now, consider the extent of the moral and political inversion in today's prevalent view of government. Instead of being a protector of man's rights, the government is becoming their most dangerous violator. Instead of guarding freedom, the government is establishing slavery. Instead of protecting men from the initiators of physical force, the government is initiating physical force and coercion in any manner and issue it pleases. Instead of serving as the instrument of objectivity in human relationships, the government is creating a deadly subterranean reign of uncertainty and fear by means of non-objective laws whose interpretation is left to the arbitrary decisions of random bureaucrats. Instead of protecting men from injury by whim, the government is arrogating to itself the power of unlimited whim, so that we are fast approaching the stage of the ultimate inversion, the stage where the government is free to do anything it pleases, while the citizens may act only by permission, which is the stage of the darkest periods of human history, the stage of rule by brute force. It has often been remarked that in spite of its material progress, mankind has not achieved any comparable degree of moral progress. That remark is usually followed by some pessimistic conclusion about human nature. It is true that the moral state of mankind is disgracefully low. But if one considers the monstrous moral inversions of the governments, made possible by the altruist collectivist morality, under which mankind has had to live through most of its history, one begins to wonder how men have managed to preserve even a semblance of civilization, and what indestructible vestige of self-esteem has kept them walking upright on 2 feet. One also begins to see more clearly the nature of the political principles that have to be accepted and advocated as part of the battle for man's intellectual renaissance. Mind you, that was penned back in December 1963, one of the various essays, as it were, that are part of this collection here. Now, mind you, again, this being penned back in the 1960s, here we are some 60 years later, and it seems like all the various things talked about there are exactly what we're seeing play out here today, especially this part here. I've seen this particular portion referenced in a number of articles over the years. The ultimate inversion. Instead of protecting men from injury by whim, the government is arrogating to itself the power of unlimited whim, so that we are fast approaching the stage of the ultimate inversion, the stage where the government is free to do anything it pleases, while the citizens may act only by permission, which is the stage of the darkest periods of human history, the stage of rule by brute force. Now, if you look at what has been playing out due to the coronavirus hoax, the pandemic, all of that, what are we seeing play out here? Are we not seeing the stage where we are about to have permission to engage in commerce? The collectivist view of the government and the whims of the government enacted through corporations now say, oh, you shall not come and partake in doing business with us unless you have this handy-dandy little card with you, right? Your little passport. Is that not our permission? Who gave the government the authority to do that in the first place? Did we consent? I think not. Chapter 15, Government Financing in a Free Society. Another one penned by Ayn Rand here. Says, what would be the proper method of financing the government in a fully free society? The question is usually asked in connection with the objectivist principle that the government of a free society may not initiate the use of physical force and may use force only in retaliation against those who initiate its use. Since the imposition of taxes does represent an initiation of force, how, it is asked, would the government of a free country raise the money needed to finance its proper services? In a fully free society, taxation, or, to be exact, payment for governmental services, would be voluntary. Since the proper services of a government, the police, the armed forces, the law courts, are demonstrably needed by individual citizens and affect their interests directly, the citizens would and should be willing to pay for such services as they pay for insurance. The question of how to implement the principle of voluntary government financing, how to determine the best means of applying it in practice, is a very complex one and belongs to the field of the philosophy of law. The task of political philosophy is only to establish the nature of the principle and to demonstrate that it is practicable. The choice of a specific method of implementation is more than premature today, since the principle will be practicable only in a fully free society, a society whose government has been constitutionally reduced to its proper basic functions. For a discussion of these functions, we can go back to the chapter we just got done reading. There are many possible methods of voluntary government financing. A government lottery, which has been used in some European countries, is one such method, and there are others. As an illustration, and only as an illustration, consider the following possibility. One of the most vitally needed services, which only a government can render, is the protection of contractual agreements among citizens. Suppose that the government were to protect, in effect, to recognize as legally valid and enforceable, only those contracts which had been insured by the payment to the government of a premium in the amount of a legally fixed percentage of the sums involved in the contractual transaction. Such an insurance would not be compulsory. There would be no legal penalty imposed on those who did not choose to take it. They would be free to make verbal agreements or to sign uninsured contracts, if they so wished. The only consequence would be that such agreements or contracts would not be legally enforceable. If they were broken, the injured party would not be able to seek redress in a court of law. All credit transactions are contractual agreements. A credit transaction is any exchange which involves a passage of time between the payment and the receipt of goods or services. This includes the vast majority of economic transactions in a complex industrial society. Only a very small part of the gigantic network of credit transactions ever ends up in court, but the entire network is made possible by the existence of the courts, and would collapse overnight without that protection. This is a government service which people need, use, rely upon, and should pay for. Yet, today, this service is provided gratuitously and amounts, in effect, to a subsidy. When one considers the magnitude of the wealth involved in credit transactions, one can see that the percentage required to pay for such governmental insurance would be infinitesimal, much smaller than that paid for other types of insurance. Yet it would be sufficient to finance all the other functions of a proper government. If necessary, the percentage could be legally increased in time of war, or other, but similar methods of raising money could be established for clearly defined wartime needs. This particular plan is mentioned here only as an illustration of a possible method of approach to the problem, not as a definitive answer, nor as a program to advocate at present. The legal and technical difficulties involved are enormous. They include such questions as the need of an ironclad constitutional provision to prevent the government from dictating the content of private contracts, an issue which exists today and needs much more objective definitions, the need of objective standards or safeguards for establishing the amounts of the premiums, which cannot be left to the arbitrary discretion of the government, etc. Any program of voluntary government financing is the last, not the first, step on the road to a free society. The last, not the first reform to advocate. It would work only when the basic principles and institutions of a free society have been established. It would not work today. Men would pay voluntarily for insurance protecting their contracts, but they would not pay voluntarily for insurance against the danger of aggression by Cambodia, nor would the plywood manufacturers of Wisconsin and the workers pay voluntarily for insurance to assist the development of the plywood industry of Japan, which would put them out of business. Interesting reference to plywood back in the 60s, given where lumber futures are here today. Very interesting timing, I suppose, but you get the point. A program of voluntary government financing would be amply sufficient to pay for the legitimate functions of a proper government. It would not be sufficient to provide unearned support for the entire globe, but no type of taxation is sufficient for that. Only the suicide of a great country might be, and then only temporarily. Just as the growth of controls, taxes, and government obligations in this country was not accomplished overnight, so the process of liberation cannot be accomplished overnight. A process of liberation would be much more rapid than the process of enslavement had been, since the facts of reality would be its ally. But still, a gradual process is required, and any program of voluntary government financing has to be regarded as a goal for a distant future. What the advocates of a fully free society have to know at present is only the principle by which that goal can be achieved. The principle of voluntary government financing rests on the following premises: that the government is not the owner of the citizen's income, and, therefore, cannot hold a blank check on that income; that the nature of the proper governmental services must be constitutionally defined and delimited, leaving the government no power to enlarge the scope of its services at its own arbitrary discretion. Consequently, the principle of voluntary government financing regards the government as the servant, not the ruler, of the citizens, as an agent who must be paid for his services, not as a benefactor whose services are gratuitous, who dispenses something for nothing. This last, along with the notion of compulsory taxation, is a remnant of the time when the government was regarded as the omnipotent ruler of the citizens. An absolute monarch who owned the work, income, property, and lives of its subjects had to be an unpaid benefactor, protector, and dispenser of favors. Such a monarch would have considered it demeaning to be paid for its services, just as the atavistic mentalities of his descendants, in spirit, the remnants of Europe's ancient feudal aristocracy and the modern welfare status, still consider an earned, commercial income as demeaning, and as morally inferior to an unearned one, which is acquired by mooching or looting, by charitable donations or governmental force. When a government, be it a monarch or a democratic parliament, is regarded as a provider of gratuitous services, it is only a question of time before it begins to enlarge its services and the sphere of the gratuitous. Today, this process is called the growth of the public sector of the economy, until it becomes, and has to become, the instrument of pressure group warfare, of economic groups looting one another. The premise to check and to challenge in this context is the primordial notion that any governmental services, even the legitimate ones, should be given to the citizens gratuitously. In order fully to translate into practice the American concept of the government as a servant of the citizens, one has to regard the government as a paid servant. Then, on that basis, one can proceed to devise the appropriate means of tying governmental revenues directly to the governmental services rendered. It may be observed, in the example given above, that the cost of such voluntary government financing would be automatically proportionate to the scale of an individual's economic activity. Those on the lowest economic levels, who seldom, if ever, engage in credit transactions, would be virtually exempt, though they would still enjoy the benefits of legal protection, such as that offered by the armed forces, by the police, and by the courts dealing with criminal offenses. These benefits may be regarded as a bonus to the men of lesser economic ability, made possible by the men of greater economic ability, without any sacrifice of the latter to the former. It is in their own interests that the men of greater ability have to pay for the maintenance of armed forces, for the protection of their country against invasion. Their expenses are not increased by the fact that a marginal part of the population is unable to contribute to these costs. Economically, that marginal group is non-existent as far as the costs of war are concerned. The same is true of the cost of maintaining a police force. It is in their own interests that the abler men have to pay for the apprehension of criminals, regardless of whether the specific victim of a given crime is rich or poor. It is important to note that this type of free protection for the non-contributors represents an indirect benefit and is merely a marginal consequence of the contributors' own interests and expenses. This type of bonus cannot be stretched to cover direct benefits or to claim, as the welfare statists are claiming, that direct handouts to the non-producers are in the producers' own interests. The difference, briefly, is as follows. If a railroad were running a train and allowed the poor to ride without payment in the seats left empty, it would not be the same thing, nor the same principle, as providing the poor with first-class carriages and special trains. Any type of non-sacrificial assistance, of social bonus, gratuitous benefit, or gift value possible among men, is possible only in a free society, and is proper so long as it's non-sacrificial. But in a free society, under a system of voluntary government financing, there would be no legal loophole, no legal possibility for any redistribution of wealth. For the unearned support of some men by draining, exploitation, and destruction of those who are able to pay the costs of maintaining a civilized society, in favor of those who are unable or unwilling to pay the cost of maintaining their own existence. Very, very interesting. So, again, as we read through this, the fact that this was kicked out back in February 1964, again, here almost 60 years later, we find ourselves dealing with these very same issues, do we not? Except in this case, they fancy up redistribution of wealth schemes. They just repackage it as, things like global warming, right? Because all that is just a redistribution of wealth scheme. They'll force corporations and whatnot to bend to ever more programs net to restrict their ability to put emissions net in the air. And eventually all that passes down to the consumer levels that you and I buy said products. And basically we end up paying for that. And who ends up winning at the end of the day? Cui bono, right? Who benefits? Certainly not us. Do we maintain and get cleaner, freer air? Maybe. But the corporations, knowing how they operate, will just find a way to cheat the system and offload their stuff elsewhere, right? All right, well, let's continue on to Chapter 16, The Divine Right of Stagnation. This one penned by Nathaniel Brandon. Says, for every living species, growth is a necessity of survival. Life is motion, a process of self-sustaining action that an organism must carry on in order to remain in existence. This principle is equally evident in the simple energy conversions of a plant and in the long-range, complex activities of man. Biologically, inactivity is death. The nature and range of possible motion and development varies from species to species. The range of a plant's action and development is far less than an animal's. An animal's is far less than man's. An animal's capacity for development ends at physical maturity, and thereafter its growth consists of the action necessary to maintain itself at a fixed level. After reaching maturity, it does not, to any significant extent, continue to grow in efficacy. That is, it does not significantly increase its ability to cope with the environment. But man's capacity for development does not end at physical maturity. His capacity is virtually limitless. His power to reason is man's distinguishing characteristic. His mind is man's basic means of survival, and his ability to think, to learn, to discover new and better ways of dealing with reality, to expand the range of his efficacy, to grow intellectually, is an open door to a road that has no end. Man survives not by adjusting himself to his physical environment in the manner of an animal, but by transforming his environment through productive work. If a drought strikes him, animals perish. Man builds irrigation canals. If a flood strikes him, animals perish. Man builds dams. If a carnivorous pack attacks them, animals perish. Man writes the Constitution of the United States. And that was Ayn Rand from the New Intellectual. Says if life is a process of self-sustaining action, then this is the distinctly human mode of action and survival. To think, to produce, to meet the challenges of existence by a never-ending effort and inventiveness. When man discovered how to make fire to keep himself warm, his need of thought and effort was not ended. When he discovered how to fashion a bow and an arrow, his need of thought and effort was not ended. When he discovered how to build a shelter out of stone, then out of brick, then out of glass and steel, his need of thought and effort was not ended. when he moved his life expectancy from 19 to 30 to 40 to 60 to 70. His need of thought and effort was not ended. So long as he lives, his need of thought and effort is never ended. Every achievement of man is a value in itself, but it is also a stepping stone to greater achievements and values. Life is growth. Not to move forward is to fall backward. Life remains life, only so long as it advances. Every step upward opens man to a wider range of action and achievement, and creates the need for that action and achievement. There is no final permanent plateau. The problem of survival is never solved, once and for all, with no further thought or motion required. More precisely, the problem of survival is solved by recognizing that survival demands constant growth and creativeness. Constant growth is, further, a psychological need of man. It is a condition of his mental well-being. His mental well-being requires that he possess a firm sense of control over reality, of control over his existence, the conviction that he is competent to live. And this requires not omniscience or omnipotence, but the knowledge that one's methods of dealing with reality, the principles by which one functions, are right. Passivity is incompatible with this state. Self-esteem is not a value that, once achieved, is maintained automatically thereafter. Like every other human value, including life itself, it can be maintained only by action. Self-esteem, the basic conviction that one is competent to live, can be maintained only so long as one is engaged in a process of growth, only so long as one is committed to the task of increasing one's efficacy. In living entities, nature does not permit stillness. When one ceases to grow, one proceeds to disintegrate, in the mental realm no less than in the physical. Observe, in this connection, the widespread phenomenon of men who are old by the time they are 30. These are men who, having in effect concluded that they have thought enough, drift on the diminishing momentum of their past effort, and wonder what happened to their fire when energy when why they are dimly anxious, and why their existence seems so desolately impoverished, and why they feel themselves sinking into some nameless abyss, and never identify the fact that, in abandoning the will to think, one abandons the will to live. Man's need to grow, and his need, therefore, of the social or existential conditions that make growth possible, are facts of crucial importance to be considered in judging or evaluating any politico-economic system. One should be concerned to ask, is a given politico-economic system pro-life or anti-life, conducive or inimical to the requirements of man's survival? The great merit of capitalism is its unique appropriateness to the requirement of human survival and to man's need to grow. Leaving men free to think, to act, to produce, to attempt the untried and the new, its principles operate in a way that rewards effort and achievement and penalizes passivity. This is one of the chief reasons for which it is denounced. In Who is Ayn Rand, discussing the 19th century attacks on capitalism, I wrote, in the writings of both medievalists and socialists, one can observe the unmistakable longing for a society in which man's existence will be automatically guaranteed to him. That is, in which man will not have to bear responsibility for his own survival. Both camps project their ideal society as one characterized by that which they call harmony, by freedom from rapid change or challenge or the exacting demands of competition. A society in which each must do his prescribed part to contribute to the well-being of the whole, but in which no one will face the necessity of making choices and decisions that will crucially affect his life and future, in which the question of what one has or has not earned and does or does not deserve will not come up, in which rewards will not be tied to achievement, and in which someone's benevolence will guarantee that one need never bear the consequences of one's errors. The failure of capitalism to conform to what may be termed this pastoral view of existence is essential to the medievalist and socialist indictment of a free society. It is not a Garden of Eden that capitalism offers men. Among the arguments used by those who long for a pastoral existence is a doctrine which, translated into explicit statement, consists of the divine right of stagnation. This doctrine is illustrated in the following incident. Once, on a plane trip, I became engaged in conversation with an executive of a labor union. He began to decry the disaster of automation, asserting that increasing thousands of workers would be permanently unemployed as a result of new machines, and that something ought to be done about it. I answered that this was a myth that had been exploded many times, that the introduction of new machines invariably resulted in increasing the demand for labor, as well as in raising the general standard of living, that this was demonstrable theoretically and observable historically. I remarked that automation increased the demand for skilled labor relative to unskilled labor, and that doubtless many workers would need to learn new skills. But, he asked indignantly, what about the workers who don't want to learn new skills? Why should they have troubles? This means that the ambition, the farsightedness, the drive to do better, and still better, the living energy of creative men are to be throttled and suppressed for the sake of men who have thought enough and learned enough, and do not wish to be concerned with the future, nor with the bothersome question of what their jobs depend on. Alone on a desert island, bearing sole responsibility for his own survival, no man could permit himself the delusion that tomorrow is not his concern, that he can safely rest on yesterday's knowledge and skills, and that nature owes him security. It is only in society where the burden of a man's default can be passed to the shoulders of a man who did not default that such a delusion can be indulged in. And it is here that the morality of altruism becomes indispensable to provide a sanction for such parasitism. The claim that men doing the same type of job should all be paid the same wages regardless of differences in their performance or output, thus penalizing the superior worker in favor of the inferior, this is the doctrine of the divine right of stagnation. The claim that men should keep their jobs or be promoted on grounds not of merit but of seniority, so that the mediocrity who is in is favored above the talented newcomer, thus blocking the newcomer's future and that of his potential employer, this is the doctrine of the divine right of stagnation. The claim that an employer should be compelled to deal with a specific union, which has an arbitrary power to exclude applicants for membership, so that the chance to work at a certain craft is handed down from father to son, and no newcomer can enter to threaten the established vested interests, thus blocking progress in the entire field, like the guild system of the Middle Ages. This is the doctrine of the divine right of stagnation. The claim that men should be retained in jobs that have become unnecessary, doing work that is wasteful or superfluous, to spare them the difficulties of retraining for new jobs, thus contributing, as in the case of railroads, to the virtual destruction of an entire industry. This is the doctrine of the divine right of stagnation. The denunciation of capitalism for such iniquities as allowing an old corner grocer to be driven out of business by a big chain store, the denunciation implying that the economic well-being and progress of the old grocer's customers and of the chain store owners should be throttled to protect the limitations of the old grocer's initiative or skill. This is the doctrine of the divine right of stagnation. The courts decree, under the antitrust laws, that a successful business establishment does not have a right to its patents, but must give them royalty-free to a would-be competitor who cannot afford to pay for them, as was the General Electric case in 1948. This is the doctrine of the divine right of stagnation. The court's edict convicting and blocking a business concern for the crime of farsightedness, the crime of anticipating future demand and expanding plant capacity to meet it, and of thereby possibly discouraging future competitors, as was the Alcoa case of 1945. This is the legal penalizing of growth. This is the penalizing of ability for being ability. And this is the nakedest essence and goal of the doctrine of the divine right of stagnation. Capitalism, by its nature, entails a constant process of motion, growth, and progress. It creates the optimum social conditions for man to respond to the challenges of nature in such a way as best to further his life. It operates to the benefit of all those who choose to be active in the productive process, whatever their level of ability. But it is not geared to the demands of stagnation. Neither is reality. When one considers the spectacular success, the unprecedented prosperity, the capitalism has achieved in practice, even with hampering controls, and when one considers the dismal failure of every variety of collectivism, it should be clear that the enemies of capitalism are not motivated, at root, by economic considerations. They are motivated by metaphysical considerations, by a rebellion against the human mode of survival, a rebellion against the fact that life is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action, and by the dream that, if only they can harness the men who do not resent the nature of life, they will make existence tolerable for those who do resent it. Oof. That penned back in August 1963. And now you hear the doctrine as described here, the divine right of stagnation, right? And of course, what do you think we're seeing play out on the streets here today, right? The Antifa types, the BLM types. It's not that they don't have the ability to gain in society. It's that they don't want to. It's like, I'm here. Earth should provide me because I'm here. Well, no. Earth was kind of here first. You kind of have to invest in making your way through it. It's not going to be handed to you on a silver spoon, right? That's kind of essentially what this is saying. And as to the union side of things here, although they may have had their purpose at some time to protect the rights of the workers from intolerable conditions because of poor industry practices, things of that nature, obviously the fat cats at the top have rode that ship to its final end. But can you teach an old dog new tricks? Do you think that the days of seniority and things of that nature can be done away with and people retrained on new equipment to be more efficient? I think so. I've seen it done. But this is where they want to go, right? The collective. They think that obviously that they're going to pull down the strong in favor of the weak. No, it's not going to work that way. It'll be equal misery all around. And at the end of the day, just like in the days of the USSR, when under communism at the time, they'll quickly find that the only way to combat that is to go to capitalism. You have to introduce competition. So that's where we'll leave that here for this afternoon. Let's see. We are now on chapter... Where did I finish up? Chapter 17. We'll finish up 17, 18, 19 on the next session of this here. So appreciate you guys tuning in as always. And of course, we'll probably be back maybe here tonight yet with some other news, things that are going on around the old webosphere. So stick around. We'll see you back then. Take care. God bless everybody.